Right. So this now takes us to the last discussion panel of the day. It's been a really great day. For those of you who are still connected, I think you are seeing that the best is still to come. So our next panel is moderated by Dr. Ramon Krishna. It's a great pleasure to introduce the president of the Logistics and Supply Chain Management Society. Dr. Ramon has held several senior positions, both at MNC shipper levels, multinational corporations from the shipper side, but also has held senior positions as a service provider. So he has both perspectives, both visions from both sides of the field. Dr. Ramon Krishna will lead a panel discussion on a topic which is certainly very challenging and provoking from a thought point of view: the imperfect balance, global assets in a constantly shifting supply chain and changing landscape. A lot of open points of discussion. Dr. Ramon, it's in your hands to take it to a new level of discussion. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Joe. Thank you very much for that very kind introduction. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for all the comments that we've had coming across. Great to see so many of you joining us, not just from the Gulf, but also here in Asia. It's almost 9 p.m. and I still see that there's a lot of people online. For those of you who've actually attended a LogiSYM webinar, we normally have a host and a co-host, and we're going to try that this evening as well during my panel. So we're going to invite Stephanie Krishnan back to join us, and we're going to be hosting this together. Part of the reason is I will have to drop off at the last minute due to a supply chain emergency, in North America. So there's lots of disruptions, and the supply chain that I manage at the moment is going through a lot of disruptions. So I will be dropping off, but we do have my co-host Stephanie Krishnan, who was on the panel earlier. So she's quite a familiar face. And joining us this evening, we've got three august gentlemen. The first being Mr. Hussein Weeby, who's probably a gentleman that doesn't need much of an introduction if you follow him on LinkedIn. He's always got very interesting anecdotes, quips, and experience to share with us. Hussein's the CEO of Fetcher, a last-mile fulfillment supply chain company. And I'll let him talk a bit more about that if he so desires. And then we've got Mr. Sanjay Desai. Sanjay is an organizing committee member of our LogiSYM symposiums. He's also had a very diverse career in supply chain, and he is now currently a recruiter. So if you're out there looking for a role, send Sanjay your CV and he'll find you a job. I'm not sure where Chris Abraham is, but Chris should be joining us. And Chris is the CEO and head of the Dubai campus of SP Jain. All right. So we've got an academic or an educationist, we've got a recruiter, and we've got a supply chain fulfillment, last mile fulfillment expert. So a fairly diverse group. And combined with Stephanie, I think it's going to be a very interesting half an hour, 45 minutes. All right. So to kick us off, and this is a question for both Sanjay and Hussein. Given all that we've seen in this last 18 months or so, are we seeing a paradigm shift away from or greater or less emphasis on supply chains and asset ownership? Trucks, warehouses, facilities, and equipment. Are we seeing this being increased, the adoption of being asset light, if you like, being increased? Or are we seeing us actually going back to the more traditional asset-heavy supply chain models? Starting with you, Sanjay.
Thank you so much, Raymond. Good evening, good afternoon, everybody. Sanjay Desai here. And thanks, Dr. Raymond, for the introduction, and thanks, Stephanie, for moderating this letter. And yes, Dr. Raymond, it's a mixed approach today, I would say. The asset-light approach, which is not necessarily a new or novel. It was always there, right? And it is poised to become more prevalent with the COVID reset button that we saw, right? With a renewed focus on sustainability and resiliency. However, it is not as easy as it sounds, right? It is a definitive departure from the vertically integrated approach that the industry used to since last 30-35 years, especially the manufacturing industry and then the conglomerate. There is a change management here in thought process, as well as in the monetization model and a financial implications, especially for the manufacturing companies, right? And remember that someone in the network, right, starting from the left hand side to the right hand side to the consumer, has to own some assets so that the whole network is operating efficiently. Now, if as a manufacturer, if you depend too much on your partners, on your vendors, then it can bite you back at some point of time because you're losing a lot of control. So the answer to that is yes, there is a definitive shift towards having and owning less assets, as indicated by a lot of companies like Uber and Netflix and others. And there is a renewed vigor also that there is indeed a shift, but it's a time and money intensive process which is going to take us some bit of a time. Raymond, back to you.
All right. Thanks, Sanjay. What about yourself, Hussein? You're in the cold face. Well, actually doing the work. What do you think?
Good afternoon, everyone. Look, it's a very interesting question, and my answer is going to be a bit similar to Sanjay. However, I'm going to talk from a small package perspective. If you see the mix today, for example, the big players in our industry, they're still investing in aircrafts. And you see also freight forwarding players who never had aircrafts. They just started to buy their own aircrafts now and build their own line hauls, which is strange. Sometimes it looks strange because it's a heavy asset step whereby they can load or co-load with others and per kilogram, per ULD, per whatever it is, which gives you an indication that there is still companies who are going into being asset heavy. However, when it comes to the small package, I think we're going more into a light asset. A lot of companies are opening today and leveraging the infrastructure of others. Sometimes you see sharing resources, sharing facilities, sharing fleet between 2 or 3 companies to reduce their costs and have a bigger delivery capacity as well. After COVID-19, I think we're going to see much more asset light. By the way, Aramex, which is 1 point something billion dollar companies I had the privilege to work with for around 18 years, has succeeded because of its asset light model. They never owned airplanes, they never owned trucks, they never owned cars, everything is leased, and they used to have very good margins. Until today, it is an example of the success of an asset light company. So yes, it is a mix depending on which type of freight, which type of logistics, but we will always see this mix moving forward, of course, with more people inclining to an asset light.
All right, thanks, Hussein. What about yourself, Chris? Thanks for joining us, Chris. Great to have you with us. Always a pleasure. The question. So Sanjay's provided his perspective. And what do you think, Chris? What's your observations here?
My background is in behavioral science. So as a behavioral scientist, let me give you the human insight on why we do what we do. So they said what they did, right? So why do we do what we do? Every time there's a catastrophe or a challenge, there's a very interesting, thing that happens, which is innovation excels. So things like these, where we have challenges, where we have catastrophes, human ingenuity comes out in the forefront, number one. Number two, because of that, the human brain goes on overdrive to look at newer business models, newer ways. Let me quote a very interesting example, which should be very dear to you, because this happens at the city of Singapore. Singapore Airlines, like a lot of airlines across the world, had to ground their planes. So here's a big challenge for an airline operator, an extremely successful airline operator, which is into cargo and into carrying people. So the first thing they did, I'm sure some of you know this, but for the benefit of the participants, the guests, I want to share this beautiful story. So they rip off they get special FTA approvals, and then they rip off all the passenger seats and convert passenger planes into, cargo planes, because cargo planes were still flying even during the pandemic. Number two, how do we make use of the human resources? That's a huge, drain on the costs. So how do you actually pay salaries? So here's where Singapore is so unique, and I really love this example. So they train their air hostesses and all the service level people on handling the pandemic. So they learn healthcare service excellence. And anyway, they're well known for their customer excellence. So Singapore airline folks become healthcare support service staff, and they get paid for it. They are part of the nation drive towards securing health, right? So second thing happens. Then the third thing, so grounded planes, still we have a lot of Airbuses sitting there, convert them. They did the other one, which of course, was controversial. So a trip to nowhere, go up and come down, then environmentalists made a hue and cry. So as I said, we're not doing it. But I love this one. For people like us who are, let's say longing for an air travel, they said we'll convert the planes into restaurants. So you can have a flying experience without flying. So I think the root of all this is the innovation inside every human being, especially when we are cornered, that we come out with. So asset light model. So we'll come out with aggregation, we'll come out with consolidation. The doomsday prophets can go to hell because we don't believe in that. Human ingenuity is far superior. We've seen that in the history of humanity, that every time there's a catastrophe, human beings come out stronger, come out more innovative, and the same thing will happen here. We'll find out newer models. Hussein was saying, why are people buying planes? They must definitely have a reason for doing it, and I'm sure they'll put it to good use. So that's how the whole system works, whether it's aggregation, whether it's new partnerships, new ventures, new ways, we'll find a way out of all this. So that would be my initial thoughts.
Thanks, Dr. Chris. And I'm going to take over as Ramon's going to go and deal with his supply chain emergency. So thank you, Dr. Ramon. Appreciate that. But I'm going to stay with Dr. Chris at the moment and say, there was mention about the gig economy, right? And how there is a role with regards to asset light. So, are we seeing this asset ownership being differentiated in gig economy supply chain operations? And is there a space for that, versus traditional supply chain operations? And how far do we think it'll go?
Is that question to me again?
Absolutely, yes.
Okay. See, I'm dealing with these youngsters. So I'll again share a personal story. So my dad started and ended his entire career with one single company, which was one of the largest tea companies in the world. It was a British company. I was very happy working for them. And so when I, 34 years back, quit my first job in 3 years, he was very concerned. He said, is there something wrong with him? I'm just married by then. So he was very worried. My son, who has quit his job in 3 years and now is, moving to a new job. So he and my mom wanted to find out, is there anything really a problem? Now, 3 years later, of course, I moved many jobs. Today, if my son does not move in 3 years, we start questioning, right? So there's a huge paradigm shift in the way we look at jobs as loyal, long-term or life-term assets. Today, the gig economy, in fact, I keep asking this question in my management classes. Now, we used to speak about loyalty, which is lifelong. In Dad's case, it was every 3-5 years in my case. My kids don't have any loyalty. They work for a morning in a gig in the morning and then snooze off during the afternoon, siesta, then work for some other company at about 7 o'clock in the night. So where do their loyalties lie? And I think the world is shifting to these newer models. So we need to be smart enough to ensure that we are able to actually address this in a more meaningful manner. This is going to be there. So I think we need to shift our mindsets from the conventional, traditional mindset. This is how we were doing things here. Well, God bless you. That's not the way it's going to happen. It's going to change. And I think change is going to be the only constant. And that includes people in supply chain. So you would have new players, newer models, and newer ways of doing things, which may not be the way it was done before. But it will certainly reflect in efficiency, operations, excellence, whatever. So this is going to be an ongoing process.
Yeah. What about Sanjay or Hussein? Do you have any thoughts on whether this is sustainable from an asset perspective?
It is. And Steph, if I need to add this, as what Dr. Chris said, right? We need to have a winning ways. And from a human relations perspective, let's just let me add a bit of a view to it. It was always there, the gig economy, right? The musicians were paid like a contractual workers, the security staff. So this has been there since 1960s. It is just that it's into a new foray and kind of COVID brought it again into the open ground, right? It is almost like a tiger testing the blood for organizations because now, as Chris just mentioned it, right? We need to embrace it with winning strategy. Now the organizations also like the idea of employing contingent workers since there are not many strings attached to it. There are no commitments, there are no long-term benefits that you need to give, and you can have them on board or have them not on board, right? As and when it required. So the added flexibility plus the added skill set and able to manage that and garner your projects in an efficient manner is something that organizations love from a human relations perspective. It is not abused. There are people available. The demand supply is actually self-fulfilling itself. So it works very well. Steph, back to you.
Yeah. So, but doesn't this throw a bit of uncertainty on supply chains then? Isn't there concern about how, if the assets aren't there, then, or if you're relying on the labor to bring in the assets, so doesn't this throw, a certain degree of uncertainty or insecurity in supply chains?
It is. And it depends on which view you're looking at. And if you're just taking a sheer personal views, you bring on temporary workers on board and they bring on their own assets, including even their laptops and stuff. You do a security and they're working tomorrow, right? You don't need to have any engagements with them. There is no orientation. There is no onboarding. You save all the costs. Now, if you're talking a third party vendor bringing on board quickly, then there are, audits issues and, due diligence that you need to do and carve it out very well. So from that perspective, depends on whom you're looking at, from a support perspective, more from an organization vendor, new product, new territory. Yes, you need to do a lot of due diligence. But people today, Stephanie, I'd be very happy to take on 50 years olds in my organization and work them for 3 months time on freelance, deliver something quick and go back. Fantastic. Nothing better than that for me.
Fair enough.
In fact, just to add to what, just one, 30 seconds, very important insight. It's not just at the lower levels. We're thinking it's at the lower levels. So a few months back, there was a very interesting request. They said, we are looking for a CEO for 3 months. Yeah. Very strange request. What do you mean 3 months? He says, we have this new concept where we're looking at, a turnaround artist who can come inside, jump inside, do his magic and then get out. I said, why should he get out? No, but that's the model we work on. So right from the bottom to the top, they are now looking at these kind of newer models, which I think is very interesting. Very, very interesting.
Certainly interesting. Hussein, any thoughts on that?
Well, the gentlemen, they said everything, but I'm a total believer in the gig economy. It's coming very fast. I'm not going to tell you it's going to replace the full-time jobs, but it's going to take part of it. As Sanjay said today, by the way, most of our warehouse people and even delivery champions are outsourced through third parties. So in principle, we don't employ them full-time. It's the same concept of a gig economy, but in a different documentation or contractual manner. Number one. Number two, to go back to Dr. Chris, I think a lot of people today who are very well experienced will prefer to work on projects per hour, per month, on assignments, earn triple what they earn in a full-time job, rather than sitting in one company and moving every 2 or 3 years. By the way, in the supply chain, you will see logistics managers not spending more than 2 to 3 years and then moving to the competition. For me as a company, this worries me. I would rather bring in people from outside on contract basis to do specific missions, train my people, and then keep them involved. They will be loyal with you forever. You will pay them, they will work for you, and there is no contractual obligations here on board. I think gig is coming, it's coming very strong, and it's great news for everybody who's being flagged as over 50 or overqualified. The gig economy is for those people, trust me, and my priorities.
Perfect.
So I think it's one way to overcome ageism, huh?
100%.
Good to know. Sanjay, you wanted to raise a point.
Yeah, so exactly what point has Hussein made, right? And just taking two of us together an example. Today, 40 is the new 50 and 50 is the new 60. And once you cross 50 and you have 25, 30 years of supply chain experience, not just by the number, but the organizations that you worked and the technology that you enabled and the solutions you created, you think at 50, 52, do you really, I never thought I wanted to work for somebody based some other country at the 40 years of age, not able to understand Asia in absolute sense. I would rather work for myself, earn humongously less money, that's okay, but at least I am in charge of what I want to do in my life for the next 15, 20 years and be very happy about it. And I think that is where people like me are thinking more, working on freelance and gig. Steph, back to you.
Yeah, so that's requiring a different I guess mindset, because typically we would expect that we would continue working, we would get a certain level of pay, and that's how we would retire. I mean, that's slightly terrifying to a 50-year-old. And do you think a lot of 50-year-olds are ready for that?
Is a question for me?
Yes, absolutely.
fine.
You're raising.
So I was thinking, and you would recall our discussions in 2012 and 13, Steph, that at what point of time, right, my mentor, which is Joe for our own LogiSYM guy, is how did you do that? And that is what has been in my mind since I'm 50. And I was praying God every day when I was 54, 55, please somebody buy my company. I get 6 months, 1 year salary. Please let me get out of the company. And one day it happened in 2017. My company was bought out. I ended up walking out of the whole company with a big fat salary check. And thereafter, I never gone back to job because I don't want to go back to job. I'm very happy in being alone. It is scary. It is absolutely scary. But money after 50s and whatever number of years that you work for over 25, 30 years in great Fortune 100 companies, money is like maybe third, fourth, or fifth in the rung in terms of priority at that age, Steph. Back to you.
Great. Thank you.
If I may add just 1 minute to that.
Certainly.
You see, today, because of the networked opportunity,
Yes.
thanks to technology, the accessibility, number one, of information, number two, of opportunities.
Yes.
So now we've been speaking about qualified CEOs, undergraduates, professionals who are grooming for careers. That's one part. Look at a typical man or woman who, for some genuine reason, said, I'm going to take a break. So this could be a typical professional woman who is working, and then she got into motherhood, took a break, and then decided, I don't want to go back to work, quote unquote, work as an official work. She has a golden opportunity today. She's got her skill sets, she's got her experience, and she's also a woman, because I believe women have extraordinary qualities to do great stuff. My company, by the way, is run by my wife. Okay, so she runs it single-handedly. She's the boss. And that was the understanding. And this is another interesting one. 58 years, when I was 58 years, we took a bold call, okay, which is the opposite of what Sanjay said. Sanjay wanted to sell his company in 50. We wanted to start a company in 58. But the understanding was that you will run it. I will do the money part, invest, but you will run it. And thank God, 4 years down the line, it's running pretty well. And she's a remarkable, let's say, head of the business. So I think, and she was a homemaker throughout. She was a qualified person, but she just took up the plunge. So here's a classic example of somebody. She was, in her 50s and then took the plunge. She's doing well, right? So I think it is opening up newer opportunities, whether it is working for somebody, working for yourself. Today, because of this technology and the awareness it has created, it gives a lot of confidence. She doesn't use me as a mentor, by the way. She gets her lessons from YouTube. She talks to women, entrepreneurial networks. She's part of half a dozen networks. She advises me. She says, this is what they said. I think you should look at this. So I think there is a very interesting change of circumstances that's happening, which we all need to, first of all, appreciate, recognize, and embrace. It's a golden opportunity. How do we tap into this knowledge, pool that is waiting to be tapped?
Great. Now, if I can bring it back to the topic where we are talking about the asset light approach, right? I do acknowledge that a lot of that is associated with the gig economy and how organizations work here. But if we just go on a slightly different tack, do we see a difference in how this asset light approach is, perceived or practiced in different regions? Say if we talk about, South Asia versus the GCC versus ASEAN, do we have any thoughts on how that is actually happening in region? Sanjay, you're nodding furiously. I'll let you take it first.
That is one way of getting attention. Just kidding. So I have a fantastic question, Steph, and then yes and no, right? And let me explain this, right? Why I'm staying on the 50-yard line. Let me decipher it this way for myself, right? The early adopters and the practitioners who will be adopting this is the private equities, the fintechs, the startups, because they are ahead of the technology, right? The late adopters will be the age-old multinationals with a very traditional, I would say, manufacturing mindset. They have the muscle to withstand a few more shocks, changing the age-old asset-based ecosystem, and embrace the new one is a very substantial time and cost-intensive, right, exercise for them. And also note that the digitalization goes hand in hand with asset management, where the startups and fintechs always have an upper hand. So depending upon which Ps you are working with, right, and then Ps bring in another dimension, which right now I'm working with one of the Ps in Malaysia, is called PEO, Professional Employer Organizations. So PEOs actually buy companies, right, and they use PEOs in between as an interim to actually buy a company and run it and then eventually sell it off. So differentiated approach in different economies, Steph, for sure. And the early adopters will be the fintechs, the startups, and the PEs who could get in and become asset-light model. Over to you.
Dr. Chris, any thoughts on this from
two thoughts. Yeah, two thoughts. So one is, there's a very interesting silent revolution happening in Africa, thanks to a unique partnership between NGOs, government bodies, and this training organization. It's called General Dynamics. Some of you may have heard of it. So what General Dynamics does is gets into Africa, Kenya, Nigeria, Ghana, so on and so forth, and then looks at people who have the basic wherewithal but don't have jobs. So what these guys do is they train them on the latest softwares. Whatever that latest software is, they train them on, and the training is free of cost. It's subsidized by the government, so the participant pays zero cost. And after, this is the best part, after, while they're studying itself, they're working on many projects, and then once they complete the training, they get absorbed into the system. They become programmers, because General Dynamics also has a lot of projects available. So beautiful win-win for the big company that does the instructional methods, win-win for the government, for the NGOs, and most importantly, for the youngsters who till then were, without jobs. This is one. There's another interesting trend which is also shaking. I'm on a board of a company called Joblio. Joblio is the world's first artificial intelligence-enabled ethical recruitment company. So this is, where we conventionally have an agent or a recruitment company that will recruit members. And many of us know that, half of it is a racket. So they promise the moon and then they take you on a ride, all kinds of, dirty things. Now they have completely reinvented that. The employee pays zero cost. The money is collected from the employer, and it's a complete, transparent, foolproof, app-based. Okay, and who are these people who are applying? It could be a fruit picker, it could be a carpenter, it could be a driller, it could be anybody. And they apply, put their resume on the app, then they get, interviewed via Zoom. They come there, and this work could be another variation of the gig economy. It could be from 3 months to 3 years, but with possibilities of continuing. So new models are emerging all over, which are all exciting.
Yeah, so I think in GCC in Africa, there's probably different types of exploration happening because of the different types of labor pools that are, and the need for micro support and that sort of thing. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Just to continue that thinking, with the asset light, given your varying perspectives and outlooks, and I'm looking into the news and seeing that we have the likes of Walmart and Home Depot chartering their own container ships, which is quite an extreme way to take asset management. Is this a trend? And what do how do you see the supply chain manager or the logistics manager in 2022? Is this going to, you've got the gig economy, you've got chartering your own ships, is that changing the way that we're doing things compared to, say, 2019 before COVID? And perhaps you could all have a shot at this question.
Well, let me comment on this, Stephanie. What I see in our industry, which is a bit different than container shipping, supply chain managers, sometimes they try to convince their bosses to open their own delivery fleet, or to bring their own assets, under the excuse always of we can't find the proper service provider. I believe this is totally wrong, because going from a fully outsourced model into a heavy asset model is going to block them from focusing on the core business. They will be deep into logistics rather than selling and working on the e-commerce priorities. So I think they need to work more on having a proper forecast for their delivery demands, for the logistics demands, and this is not being done very accurately. When you don't do a proper forecast with your delivery company, you will miss the capacities during peaks, which means you will fail in delivering on your logistics service KPIs. So I think if the supply chain managers, or the 2.0 version of the supply chain managers after the COVID-19, planning properly, forecasting properly, aligning with their delivery partners, will allow them to deliver 10 times more efficient than if they own their own vehicles, their own trucks, their own planes, whatever we want to call it. And most importantly, they should step out from the price or the cost cutting in the logistics. I always tell CFOs, and I will say it now and forever, your real fat is never in your logistics category in the P&L. Your real fat is somewhere else. Your logistics is the lifeline of the business. You don't have to go cheap, because by going cheap, you will lose your business, you will lose your clients, and you'll not gain anything. And you will lose, by the way, the loyalty of your partners with you. So my advice always, go to proper logistics players, pay a bit extra, have a long-term relationship, and then you will have a proper optimization for your cost across the years, rather than changing every year, just going to the cheapest. This is my personal advice to them, because I can see it every single day.
Great. Thank you, Hussein. Sanjay, you've come off mute, so I guess you're ready to go.
Thank you. Somebody muted me. I don't know whether it's James. So completely agree with Hussein what he said. And from a human perspective, right, I would say to supply chain managers, what you could do differently in 22 versus what you were doing until 19. Forget all 19, history is gone. COVID has resetted everything, right? We need to change and amend. So know your ecosystem in the first place. And that's what is really, Hussein alluded to. Know your ecosystem. Understand your monetization model with your product. What product you are selling? Software, hardware, tangible, non-tangible, service, supply chain as a service, blockchain as a service. So understand your monetization model. These two are very critical things. And clearly, as Hussein said, collaborative approach and build relationships over long term. Another advice I would give, and even that I do today for most of the candidates that come to me, is don't jump the gun, right? In the interim, do what is critical to retain and acquire customer base, because what is critical today is retain your customers. If you could acquire, fantastic, acquire new customers, generate your top line and bottom line, and keep the brand alive. If the brand dies, if you are not making top line, then everything becomes into a different issue, right? It discussed it, KPIs, everything else becomes, head starts to roll. So maintain your top line. Bottom line, you may let go because your SG&As can be high, but maintain the brand value. And one thing, Stephanie, is like a very normal advice is do something every day for tomorrow. Because when you go to tomorrow, metaphorically, you have tilted the needle a little bit. Over to you, Steph.
Great. Thanks, Sanjay. And Chris, advice for the supply chain manager for 2022. What should they do differently?
Let me start with an example. It's a rather old example, but very relevant even now. Many of us would have heard of a fascinating company called Li & Fung. Li & Fung echoes what fellow colleagues spoke about. Li & Fung owns nothing. They own ideas. Both these guys are Harvard-educated graduates. They came and settled in Hong Kong and said, okay, let's put the ultimate asset-light model to test. So no equipment, no infrastructure, no manufacturing. They tied up with a whole range of customers, from Gap to Marks and Spencers, you name it. They had every Gucci, all these fellows. And then they identified the best manufacturers in their class in each of these categories. And what Li & Fung does is primarily matchmaking, but of the highest quality standard. So I think we need to look at this as an interesting model, right? No assets. I'm doing the matchmaking, but I do it properly because people rely on them, people trust on them, the customer loyalty, the customer engagement, all those things are there. If I have to give an advice as an academic, I would say two things. One is continuously innovate. And the human brain is capable of doing it, especially in challenging times. So don't just settle, okay, this is the best model, God bless. No, keep continuously reinventing, apply behavioral design, apply design thinking. There are so many models that have come out, available free of cost on the net. So keep your people engaged that new ideas can come in. The second thing, which is a mantra for everybody, including me as a teacher, would be learn, unlearn, and relearn. That's all. You have to continuously keep learning, unlearning, relearning. That's the way you keep one up on the game. And that would be my advice for anybody, including all our esteemed supply chain professionals.
I agree. To be afraid of change is to be afraid of life. We need to adapt. Absolutely. Now, I'm going to throw this out there because you all kind of touched on it a little bit, the talk about innovation, the talk about, for the gig economy, you do need the collaboration ecosystem to put that together. How is technology affecting this? Like, is technology playing a role in asset ownership and how, supply chain managers and logisticians and transportation managers are actually using it? Any thoughts there? And again, Hussein, maybe, that's probably a key thing that you can comment on to start with.
Well, let me give you the bad news. Technology still is very poorly adopted in the logistics and supply chain. When we talk about the traditional warehousing, forklifts, pallet positions, and all these things. When it comes to last mile, I think the adoption of technology is playing a very big role today between AI and machine learning and predicting the next delivery locations and predicting the consumer behavior. It's excellent. But in the freight forwarding and the supply chain, it's very much we're still living in the past. I can see it every single day. And I think this is where we need to invest a lot in technologies to optimize operations, improve efficiencies, and reduce costs. Today, funnily, by the way, a lot of new companies, new logistics companies are popping up on an extremely light, I call it the feather light asset model with nothing, and they are utilizing the heavy asset companies, because those heavy asset companies are stuck with their heavy assets. The business went down, they have idle assets. So those small light asset companies are mushrooming, popping up, and utilizing the heavy assets of those other big companies. So it's a funny combination here, whereby it gives you an indication that being very much dependent on a heavy asset model will kill you during crises. When your business goes down, you will have idle equipment, idle capacity, which is costing you a lot of money.
It's interesting that you mentioned that, because IDC did a survey last year, and we actually surveyed manufacturing organizations about their supply chains. And what a lot of the supply chain operators said was that they're actually expecting to be disrupted within the next 5 years. And it's a really high percent. It's like 85% of the supply chain operators expecting to be disrupted. And it's either by new entrants into the market or the incumbents going through a digital transformation and basically doing something to change the way that the dynamics in that market. And we are seeing asset heavy companies starting to almost become commoditized, as you have like pure play cloud players come in and just start to use them as a resource, as opposed to seeing that they have any value from an innovation or an IP perspective, which is quite an interesting stance to take. So yeah, we're actually seeing that reflected as well, and that's a global phenomenon. It's not just particular to any market. Sanjay, do you have any thoughts on the technology use? I mean, Hussein has said that we're slow as an industry to adopt it, and I agree. Our maturity is quite behind in many cases. Any thoughts from you?
Sure. And I would say, manufacturing wise, the conglomerates will always be slow to get into. They will never leapfrog into technology. They will bite the bullet a couple of years or even more, see where the wind is moving, and then take it. Personally, for me, technology is not such a massive winner. And let me qualify the statement a bit carefully. I'm not in for technology. I'm not averse for technology, not anything like that. But technology for the sake of technology is no good. If your customer wants it, if it gives you a competitive edge, if it makes gain productivity, makes the product cheaper, then yes, right? Definitely not an issue there. And if you look at the new entrants, which is the fintechs and the Ps and the startups, they are all in for technology. They bring their baggage is technology. It could be a one ponytail kind of a stuff for them actually to go ahead with. But the way they do it so beautifully, you will see now blockchain as a service, as a blockchain model. You will see supply chain as a service model. You will also see 3D printing as a service model. And these are all the new disruptors where manufacturing companies will actually stop manufacturing spare parts for equipments. They will go to a 3D printer. In Singapore, it is happening today. Right now, Paul Gulimo's team is doing something on that, right? So you go to a 3D manufacturer and say, can you do these 2,500 spare parts for me whenever I want you? And you start giving a service as a 3D printer. So these are the 3 or 4 disruptors of technology that will come in and disrupt the market. But then the big fish are a bit too strong and too laid back to really suck in and do something else. Eventually they will follow, but always the disruptors will be the mean, lean and hungry players. Steph, back to you.
Great, thank you very much. And bringing that down, like you talked about the technology as a baggage. I mean, Dr. Chris, are you seeing this? And if technology is the baggage, where is the innovation?
Good question. Great question. Okay. Let me go back a little. This was a very interesting word coined by Professor Don Tapscott. Academia people would probably be familiar. Wikinomics. Wikinomics is the combination of economics, Wikipedia style. And I'm going to give the two most radical examples. One is from a gold mining company in Canada called Goldcraft or Goldcrest, right? Goldcrest. And mining, if you're familiar with that industry, is a very sacrosanct industry with the data, which is completely yours and yours alone. You don't share it with anybody.
Yeah.
But the CEO of the company went for a design thinking session in Stanford, came back enlightened and said, we're going to throw open 100 years plus data to the world at large. So he just threw it open. And then he said, we're looking for ways, because my very tricky industry, gold mining is a very Goldcorp. Sorry, it's not Goldcrest, Goldcorp. And it's a very tricky industry because you will mine millions of hectares and then find somewhere what they call the mother lode. And otherwise, you're just wasting digging holes, right? So he wanted to break that. And then he threw open the challenge to the world at large. You had professors, scientists, inventors all over the world who got into it. And here's the best part. I love this. There was a guy from Mongolia who collaborated with another scientist in New Zealand, all online, cracked the solution and won the $1 million prize. And gold mining was never the same. Gold, the gold companies' prices went off the roof. And this is a new model. Procter & Gamble did it in the R&D. They converted their R&D into C plus D, connect and develop, threw open all their radical problems to the world at large. And I think we need to have that today. The Wikinomics model, as we call it, where we collaborate with different stakeholders and get the best out of them. And then each one wins in the value chain. And the best insight is collaboration today is an accepted scientific truth. We had this wrong connotation on business. Business is all about competition. Nope. Business is not about competition. Modern business is all about collaboration with different stakeholders in the value chain. And we come together, work together. And if Goldcorp could do it in a 100-year-old traditional industry, if Procter & Gamble can radically revolutionize its innovation by doing C plus D, which was unthinkable because all this is about so-called IP, intellectual property. So you don't throw it open, but they actually threw it open and they found the revolution happening. And I think many more companies, many more industries are now realizing this and coming to the power of collaboration. So
yeah, I agree with you there. I'm actually going to go back to Covey with his 7 habits. And you talk about the 3 stages of maturity where you're talking about independence, dependence, and interdependence. And I think that interdependence and the collaboration that happens is actually where, that's where the magic happens. And we've actually seen that with COVID as well and what's been happening with organizations. Now, I know that we've hit the time and, we are on this asset light conversation. So I'm going to ask for just a quick response from the 3 of you. 5 years' time, asset heavy or asset light? Sanjay?
Asset light.
Asset light. Hussein? You're on mute. Sorry, they muted you because sorry.
But if I tell you that no asset at all, you will not believe me. But I think asset light plus.
You think it's here to stay? And Dr. Chris?
Asset light is going to be the future, but that doesn't mean asset heavy will completely vanish. You would still have people investing on it for right and wrong reasons. So you would have that, but less and less of it, but more towards asset light.
All right. Thank you very much for your time, gentlemen. Really much appreciated. It's been a very lively conversation and really well done.